Tonight's program features Kathleen Hammond, author of The Island of Peace and the Ocean of Unrest, The Letters of Dorothy von Moltke. This is an incredible family saga that has been detailed through the letters of Dorothy von Moltke. Her letters describe, among other issues, living through World War I, the rise of Nazism in Berlin, and the founding of the anti-Nazi Kreisau Circle. Helmeuth von Moltke, Dorothy's husband, was hanged for his involvement in the Kreisau Circle. Helmeuth Caspar von Moltke, grandson of Dorothy, has also joined us this evening to answer questions and talk about his family history. He is the son of World War II resistance heroes Helmeuth James and Freya von Moltke. When Kate approached me about this book, I was so very impressed about her passion for telling this story and the research that she had done. She's a wonderful woman who has given so much to this story, and I'm delighted to be able to present it to you this evening. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Catherine Hammond and Helmeuth Caspar von Moltke.
Thank you, Marilyn, for that nice introduction. It's a real joy to be here, and I must say, when I wrote Marilyn about doing a program here, she was so enthusiastic. I was so encouraged. So, Marilyn, thank you very much for allowing us to do this and arranging it and organizing it. And while I'm thanking people, I certainly want to thank Helmut Caspar von Moltke for coming. And he's a very busy man. He's constantly going to Germany and other countries and back and forth. And so it's a great privilege to have him here with us to read from the letters and answer questions afterwards. And, so I'm going to start by reading a description. It's the author's note, and it's how I stumbled on this amazing family story. And how I stumbled on it is quite a story in itself, and from it you will understand who these people are. I'm going to have to sit down because I can't manage this equipment. This is the author's note. From the moment I stumbled on the Moltke story 8 years ago, I became involved in a never-ending adventure. One day, as I was doing some routine reference work, excuse me, can everyone hear me? One day, as I was doing some routine reference work at Helmeuth Museum, where I was employed as a researcher and writer, I came across the name Helmut von Moltke in a number of Christian Science journals and sentinels. The museum is a museum about the early days of Christian Science and the life of Mrs. Elliot. Although I had been a half-hearted history student in high school, I vaguely recalled that there was an important player in German history named Moltke, who had been promoted to Field Marshal by Bismarck after the Franco-Prussian War. And so I went on the internet to see what the connection was between the Christian Scientist and the great Field Marshal. It turned out that the Helmut von Moltke in the church periodicals was indeed the grandnephew of Field Marshal Helmut Karl Bernhard von Moltke, architect of the Prussian victory over the French in 1871. As I searched the internet some more, I discovered that the Christian Scientist had a son named Helmut James von Moltke, who was a hero of the German resistance executed by the Nazis in 1945. I should say that that is the father of the gentleman beside me. I read on and learned that, amazingly, Helmut James's widow, this gentleman's mother, was still living, now aged 94, in Norwich, Vermont. Next, I read a biography of the Moltkes, Blood and Iron, From Bismarck to Hitler, the von Moltke family's impact on German history, by Otto Friedrich. In it, I learned that a younger brother of Helmut James named Wilhelm Wilhelm von Moltke had left Germany in 1937 for England, ending up in the United States, where he was made an officer in the United States Army. After the war, he studied architecture with Walter Gropius at Harvard's Graduate School of Design in Cambridge, Massachusetts, later becoming a professor of urban planning there. As I live in Cambridge, my deskmate, married to a German girl and as fascinated by this story as I was, suggested that I look up the younger brother in the phone book. which I did, as I live in Cambridge. Lo and behold, I found a Mrs. Wilhelm von Moltke living at an address 3 blocks from my home. I dialed the number. A German accented voice answered, "Yes, this is Mrs. Wilhelm von Moltke. What can I do for you?" I was astonished. Suddenly, I had stepped into history. I explained my interest in learning more about the Christian scientist named Helmut von Moltke, whose name appeared in our church periodicals. "Oh," she replied, "you want to talk to my sister-in-law, Freya, the widow of the German resistance hero." Mrs. von Moltke, Veronica, then gave me Freya's phone number in Vermont. When I called, another German accented but deeper voice answered. It was Freya von Moltke. She invited me to come for an interview, and 2 weeks later I was in my Ford Escort, headed for the hills of the Green Mountain State. After a long drive, I arrived at a typical Vermont wooden house where I was greeted by a very lively lady with a shock of white hair and a friendly smile. I finally got to use a phrase I'd always loved. "Guten Tag, gnädige Frau." "Good day, madam." She laughed and invited me in. A few weeks after returning to Cambridge, I received a note from Freya announcing that copies of all of Dorothy von Moltke's letters had arrived at her home. Would I like to come and read them? For the next 6 months, I made several trips to Norwich, where seated at a small table in the guest room, I perused the letters of Dorothy von Moltke, wife of Count Helmut von Moltke, and there began the next chapter in my adventure with the Moltke story and my love affair with Dorothy's over 750 letters to her parents in South Africa. Now, I should explain that this gentleman's grandmother, Dorothy von Moltke, married to, I have to say also that several people in this family are named Helmut von Moltke. But fortunately, in the beginning of the book, there's a detail of all the Helmut von Moltkes, about 5 of them. And so there was the field marshal who was born in 1800, and his great-nephew, the Christian Scientist, born in 1876, married to the woman who wrote letters, and then their son was the World War II hero. The lady who wrote these letters, Dorothy von Moltke, was actually South African. Her father was Chief Justice of South Africa from 1914 to 1927, and a very outstanding Chief Justice. He was an early advocate of the rights of blacks in South Africa. We're talking about the turn of the century. He was Attorney General under Cecil Rhodes. He was a very good friend of Jan Smuts, the great leader of South Africa, and he himself was a lawyer and very involved in politics in South Africa and in the formation of the South African Union, leading, of course, to what we have now, the Republic of South Africa. And I often think if they'd listened to your great-grandfather, they could have avoided a lot of the problems with apartheid and so forth, because he was a man with a passion for justice, and he saw the need for justice for all the people of South Africa, regardless of color. So she wrote these letters. She met her husband on a Bildungsreise, which in German is a sort of educational tour. She and her mother were touring Germany, and they read an ad in a newspaper in Dresden for paying guests on an aristocratic country estate in Silesia, eastern part of Germany. And the one requirement was a good-handed bridge. So the mother, the wife of the Chief Justice and their daughter Dorothy, Rose Innes was their name. They both played bridge, so they went to the estate, and a wonderful thing happened. That she and the Count fell in love. There's much more to this story, but we want to get to the letters, I think. So anyway, they ended up having 5 children, and the eldest of them was this resistance hero who is the father of Helmut Kasper. I'll be telling you more about that in a while. When I interviewed Freya, I asked her about her mother-in-law, the lady from South Africa. I hope you're not getting confused. Freya summed up her mother-in-law's character in this luminous description to me. Quote, "She was handsome, but she had sort of a glow from inside, that came out, which was her charm. But charm is too shallow a description. It was an inner strength and loveliness that shone through her, and you had to fall in love with her. You had to love her. She was very warm and very intelligent. She really was loved by everybody, and she was a wonderful, warm, understanding center of Kreisau. That's very much in the letters, of course. Try to add it. So that is the description of the lady who wrote these letters. The South African lady who came to Germany and never looked back. She did actually go back quite often to visit her parents. It's 8,000 miles, so she didn't go off too often, maybe every couple of 2 or 3 years, I think, and she'd stay quite a while. She was the only daughter of this couple, and of the Chief Justice and his wife, Lady Jessie Rose Innes. So it was heartbreaking, really, for them to have the daughter leave South Africa. But it was a wonderful marriage, and she was a great family woman. And so her first son, the World War II hero of the German resistance, was born in 1907. I'm going to read a letter written on March 11, 1907, soon after Helmut James von Moltke, this gentleman's father, was born. We're going to be alternating reading from the letters. Beginning of family. On March 11, 1907, Dorothy gave birth to her first son, Helmut James von Moltke, named after her husband Helmut and her father, Sir James Rose Innes. She describes in detail the April christening in the field marshal's room at the Schloss, which means castle, or in this case, large manor house. You see it on the cover. With the older generation reverently gathered around. Quote, "It was a moving scene. The simple and historic room. The old Moltkes very touched by the memories that crowded in upon them, and this youngest of all Moltkes, unconscious of a past or a future, deeply interested, however, in the present he certainly was, and as he was placed in the arms of one godparent after another, he looked up into their faces with large, wondering eyes." I should add, he was only a few days old at this point. He wore the cap and dress which Hammond and his father had worn before him, and in spite of being actively seasick, the little son behaved during the whole ceremony, which lasted about 35 minutes, in the most perfect manner. First we sang a hymn, then came the christening service and a short sermon. As text we had chosen, "For I am persuaded that neither life nor death, nor principalities nor powers, nor things present nor things to come, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus." It is one of my favorite texts, and therefore it was chosen. After the sermon, the babe was handed to each godparent in turn, and finally Monica, the youngest of these, held him with the sign of the cross, while the sign of the cross was made, and his name Helmut James Ludwig Wilhelm Eugen Heinrich was given him. Dorothy writes, "Does that take your breath away? Helmut and I wanted to call him Louis James, but the family was so distressed at his not being a Helmut that we had to give in to tradition." Then the little one was placed on my lap, another hymn was sung, and the pastor gave us his blessing. Thus was my son baptized. Kreisau, April 5, 1907.
And I'm now going to read you a letter from January 9th, 1910. Perhaps I should add that my grandparents married in 1905, and my grandmother died in 1935. So the years of her life in Germany were fairly momentous, with the First World War, the Weimar Republic, and then the rise of Nazism. But she didn't see the end of the Second World War, even many of the atrocities which occurred later. So this is a letter from January 9th, 1910, and it is making their curtsies to His Majesty. In the winter of 1910, Count and Countess von Moltke were presented at court, an imperative for people of their social position. In January, they attended the court ball hosted by the Kaiser in Berlin, also the many dinner parties and smaller balls of the court season. There the Moltkes were presented to the Kaiser and Kaiserin and met royals from other countries as well. Quote, Prince Oscar, one of the Kaiser's sons, and the young Crown Prince of Greece were there. And after I had been engaged for the cotillon and had danced about 10 minutes, I discovered that my partner was the latter. I attempted one sentence in the third person and then boldly asked him to talk English, which of course he speaks perfectly. After that we got on much better, but it was rather a bombshell when I discovered who he was, for I thought him just a very young officer, which he is, and was not exerting myself overmuch in the matter of conversation. I was taken into supper by a young attaché who had been a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and loved England, as indeed all those who have been there seem to do. And I'm going to follow up with another letter from this is a short period later, dated January 30th, 1910. In late January, the Moltkes attended an elegant evening at Schloss Bellevue, an opulent candlelit ball at which the Kaiser and Kaiserin were present. Schloss Bellevue lies buried in the Tiergarten, a large park in Berlin, and is very old. Most beautifully furnished is it too, and everything looks so lived in and used and individual. The whole palace is lit by candlelight, with here and there an oil lamp, and the light is wonderfully soft and pretty. The ballroom is oval, and white with some marble pillars of a beautiful greeny blue color. There were about 100 to 150 present, among others the Kaiser and Kaiserin, the Crown Prince of Romania, a famous beauty, Crown Princess of Romania, my apologies, a famous beauty, Prince and Princess August Wilhelm, two of the unmarried princesses, and a little princess who is going out for the first time. Then Princess Friedrich Leopold with her daughter, the Crown Prince of Greece, and a number of smaller royalties as well. Princess Pless was also there, but I was disappointed in her looks. I was presented to the Kaiserin, who spoke a few words in English to me, and I also shook hands with the Kaiser, but I don't think he knew who I was. At supper, I sat at the table next to his, and so had a good opportunity of seeing him. He is a fine-looking man, with a black moustache, iron grey hair, and such alive eyes. The Kaiserin has beautiful white hair and looks sweet, friendly, and rather stupid. English seems to be the international speech. The Crown Princess of Romania, the Crown Prince of Greece speak almost always in that language, and one heard it all around one. The daughters of the Italian ambassador spoke it too, and quite a number of others. It is evidently chic. We eat off silver plates, and altogether it was a very interesting experience. I wore my green Boulmier christening dress, and I hope did the authors of my being justice.
That was, of course, 1910, but 4 years later, tragedy really struck when World War I broke out, and the life there changed dramatically. This is a letter. I'm going to read it from a letter from 1914, July 31, 1914. Of course, this is just before the outbreak of World War I. The heading is "War Looms on the Horizon." But by July, war was in the air, and the English nanny was returning to her homeland. The von Moltkes had a lot of English nannies to help taking care of the children. Quote, martial law has been declared. Oh, I want to say something else. Not only was the great uncle of Dorothy's husband a field marshal, but his uncle also also named Helmut von Moltke, was the field marshal or the chief of general staff under Wilhelm II during World War I. So she does refer here to Onkel Helmut, and she's talking about the chief of general staff in Berlin. Quote, martial law has been declared and the army in East Prussia has mobilized. It looks uncommonly like war, and already no letters or telegrams are allowed to be sent abroad. Miss Chalmers, Nanny, leaves tonight and is taking this letter and a cable with her, for I do not know how long it may be before you hear from me again. Anyway, don't worry about us. We are sure to pull through all right. As the Moltkes reorganized their lives in preparation for the impending conflict, Dorothy's faith sustained her. Uncle Helmut, that's Chief General Staff, telegraphed today advising us to stay quietly in Kreisau. So the Trottes, the Berghaus, and I remain here. Muttel, the boys, and the two big ones, and Leno go to Hanover, and the YT for the present is in Schweidnitz. Muttel is her mother-in-law. Muttel, of course, is a term for mother in German, and it's her mother, her husband's mother. And the YT is actually her husband. He got that name, I think her father gave him that name, and it stands for Young Teuton. So the YT, she says, the boys and Leno and Muttel all go to Hanover, and the YT for the present is in Schweidnitz. That's a town right near Kreisau. All the horses and the motor will be commandeered, and Hermann and our manservant have to leave at once. Tomorrow, unless things look much brighter, we will pack away the silver and all the entailed and valuable things, and then await events. There will be plenty of work for us all to do, and I am so sure of God's protection that I do not feel a bit anxious, only very sober. We have bought plenty of provisions, and on Monday we'll make sausage and Pickelfleisch, corned beef. The telephone service here is interrupted, and nothing of a private nature is allowed to pass. And now, beloved ones, goodbye. Don't worry. We are all well, and with God's help, we'll keep so. July 31, 1914.
And I'm now going to read you a letter after the end of the First World War. Dorothy and her family and everybody survived those years, and even though she was a British subject in Germany during that war, she was always treated with great respect and never suffered any disadvantage. But of course, the war was a great drain on Germany, and everything became much scarcer. Food was scarce, and it became difficult. And I'm going to read you now a letter which is actually a description of Sir James Rose Innes, of when he first met his daughter and grandchildren again in the spring of 1919. In the spring, the Moltke family was able to get away from the misery of post-war Germany and take refuge in The Hague, Netherlands, for a 2-month visit with Dorothy's parents, who had traveled from South Africa. In his autobiography, Sir James describes the effect of the war on his daughter's family. We arrived at The Hague early in April. Dorothy and her children were already there, and we spent 2 delightful months together. They were all rather fine drawn. The blockade had left its mark upon them, in spite of the fact that they had all along resided in the country. The children were peaked and sallow, and their mother declared that she felt as if she never wanted to look at mangold wurzel, Swiss chard, or potatoes again. The younger children had never seen an orange. We had brought a store of goodies from the Cape, and the process of making up for lost time was a pleasure to all concerned. To our little war-sundered family, The Hague was a charming trysting place. The leisurely unfolding of a European spring is in strong contrast with the brief interlude between the seasons which prevails in most parts of South Africa, and we were in the middle of the bulb country. Wherever we traveled, acres of color were splashed upon the verdant landscape. Dutch bulbs are renowned the world over, and the industry is a valuable one. It has the advantage of being carried on in beautiful surroundings and of yielding a lovely byproduct.
As you can see, Dorothy's father was quite a good writer too. And I'm going to read from a letter written in 1924, this is 5 years later, because I want to give you a taste of Dorothy's sense of humor and also the fun. This family had a lot of fun. And Dorothy loved her family, her husband and her children, and she had a great sense of humor. And she just enjoyed family life, and it really comes out in the letters, and it's one of the things I so enjoyed about reading her letters. This is Winter at Kreisau. Owing to the heavy snows and slow trains in January 1924, the family at Kreisau felt practically cut off from the world. Dorothy describes a comical moment with her sons and Mutter, her mother-in-law. Quote, "The children have been skiing and driving on their toboggans with the pony inspanned, harnessed, in front, a row of them, one behind the other. And the boy," that's the eldest son, "skiing with the pony too, all very happy and enjoying their holidays immensely. On Sunday we all supped at the Berg house, and 4 boys pulled and shoved Mutter, who sat crunched up in the little hand sledge we had for the boy when he was 2 years old. It was most comical, Mutter thoroughly frightened, but not wanting to stay at home alone, and so willing to suffer greatly, with her whole head, face, and all done up in cloths and mufflers. You may imagine the jokes and laughter." Dorothy's 40th birthday celebration included hilarious performances by the children. The birthdays were a big thing in the family, as most families are, but they had quite elaborate birthdays. I mean, it involved theatricals, really. She describes one of these theatricals with the children and the Fräuleins, which are the nurses and the young women who help the family. "The Fräuleins, pretending to be a troupe of wandering English players, acted, sang, and danced, and amused us generally for more than an hour. Jovo," that's the second son, who at this time was about 13. "Jovo is an extraordinarily clever comic actor, and Asta, their youngest, who is their only daughter, and Sibi, the 4th son, were perfectly ducky as peasant children, dancing and singing together. Willow, that's the 3rd son, as a dry-as-dust professor with spectacles, was indescribably funny, but the clue, the highlight, was a butterfly dance by Jovo, dressed in black gauze with an apricot-colored sash, who danced quite as well as Joseph in the Legenda we saw together in Breslau. Everyone was most impressed and much entertained." Kreisau, March 5th, 1924. And in the evenings, the Count read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain aloud to the children, in German, of course. February 28, 1924.
And now we go to 1931, February 7th, 1931. And this foreshadows the arrival of the Nazis. My father at that stage had begun to translate for American journalists working in Berlin. And he was at that stage about 20 years old. He'd begun this at 20 years old and had befriended some very well-known American journalists who were active in Berlin in those days. Besides what I'm going to tell you now about Dorothy Thompson, there was Edgar Maurer and his wife, who all visited Kreisau in those years. But it talks about Nazi bigwigs. Dorothy Thompson, who was writing a series of articles on Germany for her American newspaper, the New York Evening Post, invited Helmut James to meet and discuss economic questions with 3 of the Nazi bigwigs: Gregor Strasser, who leans towards the socialist side, Gottfried Feder, the intellectual, whose Byzantine Nazi reasoning mystified the young man, and another whose names I have forgotten. Quote, "They discussed things for about an hour, but the boy says he simply can't understand them. It's like discussing astronomy with someone who believes that the sun is not the center of our system, but say Saturn. He didn't find them foolish or wild, but simply starting from some hypothesis which he didn't grasp." Kreisau, 7th of February 1931.
You read another one? The Nazi girl?
Yes, and then I'm going to read you another one, which is in June 1932. She writes about Nazi girls. "I haven't made much mention of politics in my letters because I simply don't know what to say about things. It really seems like a disease in Germany, and it is chilly weather for people with liberal standpoints. Personally, I don't think the new government is doing so badly, except for the fact that the Nazis, under whose influence they seem to stand, insist on von Papen," he was the chancellor, "doing some incredible things such as allowing the stormtroops to parade again and the Nazis to wear uniforms, which has resulted in a reign of terror in the streets and a very serious situation between the southern states and the Reich, for the former have refused to allow the wearing of uniform, and the Nazis have become more swollen-headed than ever. Nearly every day there are uproars at one or other of the universities as a result of the Nazi epidemic. People think the best way of answering an argument is by sticking the opposing party on the head. Even school children, like their own daughter Asta, were feeling the effects of the Nazi epidemic. Quote, "It is deplorable, and I do feel so terribly sorry for those young people like mine who are simply out of place in the noisy and brutal world of people without ideas. Even Asta has had horrid experiences at school, where nearly all the schoolgirls are Nazis, and who, as a matter of course, try to bully the whole school. The older people are afraid, many of them, to take a stand against this senselessness, as they think they will lose their positions when the Nazis come to power. And no one can afford to lose his job nowadays. So there you have a sad state of affairs. Liberal thought and ideals, humanism in fact, seem dead. I wonder whether it will revive later on. In the meanwhile, a young man like Helmeuth or Hans, my father's brother-in-law, Jovo or Willow, feel disgusted, depressed, and entirely out of place. It is indeed deplorable. We, however, in our dear little Berghaus, try to forget all the noise and intolerance outside, and are happy and cheerful, and oh so sorry that this happy time with the children is fast coming to an end. But life never stands still, does it?
I'm going to read another letter from 1932. It's an interesting vignette of Hitler. The von Moltkes had a very good friend, a Jewish educator named Schwarzwald, Eugenie Schwarzwald. He was married to a very successful lawyer in Vienna, and she was a very bright lady and full of brilliant thoughts and a lot of very exuberant lady. And she stayed in Berlin at the Kaiserhof Hotel, which is the same hotel where Hitler stayed. And this letter is a very interesting view of Hitler from the point of view of the elevator operator in that hotel. He was not a bit impressed by Hitler. Despite his royal pretensions, those who got an up-close view of the Führer were not overawed by him in the least, as Dorothy discovered when she visited Frau Dr. Eugenie Schwarzwald at the hotel, the Kaiserhof in Berlin, where Hitler was staying. Quote, "He is staying at the Kaiserhof Hotel, where Frau Doctor always stays, and there are always crowds around the hotel. But to my surprise, I find that the hotel employees, even the page boys, are not a bit impressed by him. The liftman said to me yesterday when I went to see Frau Doktor, "Ja, es ist komisch. Wir Deutschen müssen immer etwas haben zu annehmen." Offer incense to. Erst war es Wilhelm, jetzt Hitler. Fürchterlich. Yes, it's funny. We Germans must always have someone to worship, literally offer incense to. First it was the Kaiser Wilhelm, now Hitler. Frightful.
And now comes the Nazi period, and I'm going to read you a letter which dates from July 1933. And my father, in the meantime, had qualified as a lawyer in Germany. And in the German government, once the Nazis came to power, brought in a rule which required that any person wanting to get a license as a lawyer needed to go to what they called an assessor camp, a camp where they were basically being brainwashed. And so my father, Helmut James, had to go to this camp in 1933. Quote, "Now that Helmut James's exam is drawing near, the question of the assessor camps is becoming rather acute. Of course it is all very distasteful to him, but I hope, if possible, that he will go through with it, so as to get his assessor title, so to speak. In these camps they are for 6 weeks to hear nothing except lectures on 1. What the National Socialist Revolution implies, 2. The position of the stormtroopers within the Nazi movement, and a 3rd theme on similar lines. They are to take no law books with them into camp, and I suppose when they are not listening for 6 long weeks to these eulogies, they will be made to drill or something of the sort. The idea is to make good Nazis of these future functionaries during the 6 weeks, drumming into them the virtues and ideals of Hitlerism. And that, of course, to many will be very distasteful, singing of Nazi songs, etc. The head of the camp is a stormtrooper man who has, for this purpose, been made a public prosecutor." Enough said. Kreisau, 17th of July, 1933.
This book is actually in 2 parts. The bulk of it, like the 2/3 of it, or 3/4, I should say, are the letters of Dorothy von Moltke. The second part tells about what they did as members of the Christian Science Church in Germany. They did a major contribution. They served on the committee that translated the textbook of Christian Science, Science and Health, Heated Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, into German in 1912, which involved a 7-month stay in the United States. They had 3 very young children, but they made that sacrifice. And I want to tell a little bit about Dorothy's husband, what he did. He became a Christian Science practitioner. He had a wonderful healing of what the Germans call schwere Nervenleiden, which I guess is nervous prostration or depression.
Depression.
Depression. It was a wonderful healing. He'd had a very sickly childhood, and he had this marvelous healing. And he became a practitioner and a teacher, and he also represented the church in Germany as sort of a public relations position for a few years. And I'd like to read a little bit what she says about his practice and the healings that he accomplished as a practitioner in Berlin. Their house was in Silesia over in the east, but they also, well, of course, Berlin is Eastern Germany too, but they had an apartment in Berlin also, and that's where he mainly practiced. Soon after, he had class instruction with a teacher in Hanover, a woman named Bertha Günther Petersen, which is where he was trained to be a practitioner. Soon after class instruction, the Count plunged into the work of Christian Science healing In the spring of 1908, he rented an apartment in Berlin to which his patients came for Christian Science treatment. By the following year, the Count was healing with excellent results. Quote, Helmeuth has plenty of work and is doing very well, Dorothy wrote her mother from Berlin. One of his patients, a crippled boy who suffered from atrophy of the muscles and had not been able to stand for several years, quote, can stand now for a short time and move his legs, which up till now has been impossible. Some cases are entirely cured already, so that Helmeuth is very happy, feeling that he is being able to help people. Berlin, March 10, 1909. We're going back a little bit in time here. A letter written 2 weeks later includes an account of 2 other healings of conditions that had persisted for long periods of time. Quote, several of the Count's patients are already completely cured. One of an awful skin disease and irritation for which she had tried everything for 5 years. The other of asthma, which was so bad that for 7 years the woman never went outside except in very warm weather. From the first treatment on, she went everywhere she wanted, even to the Wednesday evening meetings, those are Christian Science church meetings, during the icy weather, and now the asthma has completely left her. That's Berlin, March 24, 1909. The success of her husband's healing work was a source of great joy to the Count and Countess, who proudly told her mother, you may imagine how happy the patients are, and Helmeuth too, March 24, 1909. The next section is letter is about the healing of a horse that fell off a bridge. The von Moltkes they had these enormous estate, several properties in Silesia. It's a beautiful place. I went there 4 years ago. And it's vast fields where they raised barley and all sorts of corn and products or food. And they were going through the fields and they came across a bridge which was evidently in disrepair, and the horse fell off the bridge. And so I'm writing, the previous year, another wonderful healing had taken place of the Count's horse, Diana, who had fallen off a bridge. The Count was almost certainly praying, I said, for this beloved mare, for the healing was so quick and complete that it astonished even the district veterinarian. Quote, Helmeuth's horse, Diana, is, I'm glad to say, quite in order once more, Dorothy wrote less than 2 weeks after the mishap. I should explain, I don't want to take the time to read the whole letter, but what had happened was the horse fell off the bridge and his head was submerged in the water, and the Count very quickly pulled out a knife and cut the reins off, cut the bridle off so that the horse could free his head. And as I said, the veterinarian said that it was very rare that these conditions were healed after a horse had been in that situation. The likelihood that Diana was healed through the Count's prayers is corroborated by a report in 1941 by the head of the Reich Main Security Office, Reinhard Heydrich. That was known as the Nazi butcher, I believe. He was a sort of very well-known Nazi who did a lot of harm, caused the death of many, many people. But he wrote this report to the government about he was actually reporting on the Christian Science Church and why it should be outlawed, which it was in 1941 in Germany. And he was trying to portray the family as being a little crazy, they heal horses. So he wrote, in the family of Count von Moltke, it is generally known that even the horses were healed through prayer. Well, I was interested in that because it confirmed my sense that that is how the horse was healed. So, hope you can follow all that. But anyway, the Moltkes loved their horses, and especially the Count. He was a great horseman, and he was also a great shot with a rifle. If they needed some meat, he would just go out and shoot a stag or whatever. And he was quite adept at these traditional skills of country aristocrats. The next last part I'm going to read is what I have to say about Dorothy's sense of destiny. This is in this latter part of the book. This is the last chapter. When the Count and Countess von Moltke married at the dawn of the 20th century, Dorothy and Helmut von Moltke did not know about the cataclysmic events that lay ahead. They were married in 1905, if I didn't say so earlier. Through all the twists and turns of their lives, however, both von Moltkes were sustained by a strong sense of God's direction and support, which enabled them to carry out their mission together in their family life and in their work for the Christian Science Church, which one of the sons observed formed the ethical basis of their marriage. Dorothy always had the firm conviction, even a slightly mystical sense of destiny, that she was in her, quote, right place, unquote. In 1910, after 5 years in her new life in Germany, she wrote her parents that she still felt that, quote, this is my place, that I have a work to do that none other could do. This sounds conceited, but it is not, for I know too well that each has a work which is his to accomplish, and therefore is it any wonder that I am happy? But it certainly was a strange business that the fates should have chosen me to fill this place. Cries out, July 17, 1910. I'd like to read from my last selection from the epilogue, because when I wrote this manuscript, I showed it to a friend. He's sitting right over there, Alan Parker. And he said, well, what happened to the children? You didn't say what happened to Dorothy's children. So I wrote an epilogue. And I begin with a phrase from Dorothy. In 1911, Dorothy wrote prophetically, my 3 little sons, I dream that someday they may prove a blessing to the world. Cries out, May 30, 1911. Well, as you know now, these children were wonderful children, all of them really, and the eldest one was particularly heroic in his stand against Nazism. He was a legal advisor, actually, to the German High Command. And he was drafted. He couldn't do anything about that. But he did use this position to, he was, of course, the whole family were opposed to Nazism. They didn't fly the swastika, which was illegal not to fly the swastika at their Schloss in Silesia. And they were opposed to Nazism. And he had a circle called the Kreisau Circle, which were a group that met during World War II secretly to plan for the kind of Germany that they hoped they would have after what they hoped and expected would be the fall of the Third Reich. He also used this position in the German government, in the Nazi government, which he was opposed to help people get out of Germany. A number of Jews owe their lives to him. He also helped the Poles by redefining their status as not rebels, but as enemies of, what is the term? Enemies of the country.
Enemy combatants.
Enemy combatants, thank you. I forgot what the phrase was. Because as if they were accused of treason, then their lives were, they would be killed. But as enemy combatants, their lives were spared. So many people owed their lives to Helmut James von Moltke, the eldest son. I'd like to read the interview that I had with Freya von Moltke 10 years ago, Helmut's mother, the widow of Helmut James von Moltke, the lady you heard about in the introductory note. Because what happened was that because he was helping people get out, there was a man named Otto Kiep whom he warned. Because of his position in the government, he knew very often who was going to be arrested next. So there was a man named Otto Kiep who was about to be arrested, and he warned Kiep, you've got to get out of the country. Well, unfortunately, somebody blabbed about this at a cocktail party, and a Nazi Gestapo officer was standing right there and heard this and reported it. So Helmut James was thrown in prison in Berlin and then taken to Ravensbrück. Then in July of 1944, when Klaus von Stauffenberg attempted to kill Hitler, they rounded up hundreds of the German resistance people, and of course, Helmut James was already in prison, and they brought him to Germany, brought him to Berlin. And he was tried, he was in the Tegel prison in Berlin at the end of 1944 until January of 45, which point he was tried in the Volksgerichtshof, which is the People's Court, by a notorious judge named Roland Freisler. I believe there are actual tapes of documentaries of that trial, aren't there?
They were lost. It was recorded, but they were lost in the war.
I see. So he was tried by Freisler, and he was accused of treason, although he never broke any German laws. And he was hanged in January 23, I think, of 1945, 5 months before the end of the war. So it was. He's also now very much been honored by the German government. Angela Merkel spoke, I believe, at a ceremony commemorating his birth in 2007. He was born in 1907. And he was, and there were 4 stamps the German government has put out with his face on them, so his image. So I'd like to tell about the interview in which Freya, his widow, told me about how she tried to help him get out of prison. This was in December, when they were writing letters back and forth, and there was a man named Höfler who was, I think he was a chaplain in the prison, and he risked his life because if he'd gotten caught doing this, he would have been killed too. But so there were these letters. There was a book called Letters to Freya, which were originally, of course, in German translated. It's quite a classic of World War II now. And so she told me about this episode of trying to get her husband out of prison. That's quite a story. On a November afternoon in 2004, I had the privilege of interviewing Helmut James's widow, Freya, in her cozy Vermont living room. Helmut said to me, quote, she said, I should arrange an interview for him with Müller, she told me. She was referring to the SS, that's Schutzstaffel, Obergruppenführer General Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo. To her surprise, she was able to get an appointment with him. She was astounded that Müller treated her as well as he did. Quote, I went in there and up there. There were young, black, uniformed SS people. I waited, and then I was let in to Müller. By the way, the family knew, she and her husband knew Müller. That's how she was able to gain access. I had a conversation with Müller, and you know, Müller did either not want to know that I knew something, or he believed I knew nothing about anything. At least he treated me as if I knew nothing, and in the end, he said to me, he ran after me after I had finished, and said, yes, he would give him an interview, but it didn't help. From their point of view, he, Helmut James, was an arch enemy. I commented to Freya that she showed great courage and daring in going to see the chief of the Gestapo. She said, I must tell you, I always sort of did things without thinking whether they were difficult or not difficult. Looking back, it was quite enterprising. I wasn't thinking on those lines at all at the time. Freya then told me about Müller's surprising offer. She said, in any case, I was in the corridor. After all, Müller was the top man of the Nazi SD, and he came running after me, and he said to me, and you know, when it's all over, which of course means Helmut's dead, you come to us, and we will help you. Oh, as if I would ever have come to them. After killing your husband, I interjected. Freya continued. And then I come running and want their money? No. But I mean, there, you see this extraordinary thing, why we could do so much for so long without being found out. I asked her whether at the time of his arrest and imprisonment, her husband became more interested in spiritual matters and started reading the Bible at that time. Freya replied, yeah, absolutely. Much more. She described the spiritual struggles her husband went through during his incarceration and how he would time and again rise out of the depression that seemed to engulf him. she said. Then he'd rise several times, not only once. It was a very hard year. But he also says it was a quite extraordinary year. He would be nobody without it. He's very much impressed with what he lived through, but it was hard. I'm just going to say, postlude, that he had a dream of a united Europe and a non-militaristic Germany. The Kreisau Circle was planning for a non-militaristic, democratic Germany. And the happy side of the story is that though he was cruelly killed, the dream came true in a sense that Germany is now a democratic and very much less militaristic, I would say non-militaristic country. And they have a united Europe. And also the Kreisau estate, which the family had to leave in January of 1945, the end of the war, 25 years ago, was renovated by the Polish and German governments and is now a wonderful peace center called the Kreisau Foundation for European Understanding, where young people from all over Europe and other countries too, I believe, come and learn about how to wage peace and learn from Helmut James how to stand up to dictators and wicked governments and demonstrate that kind of moral courage that he stood for. So, and Helmut does a great deal, I believe, for raising money for it and keeping it going.
Yes, I'm on the board of it, and we take people from all over, mainly Eastern Europe. For instance, we've been having Ukrainians come in large numbers over the last years, and since the Ukraine is currently in everybody's mouth. But I wanted to just say one thing. Perhaps Kate phrased something incorrectly. My parents did not know the head of the Gestapo. He was, obviously, we did not seek to have contact with these people under any circumstances. But we were, to some extent, in a curious situation, even though we were opponents of the regime. The Nazis saw themselves in the tradition of the Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke of the Franco-Prussian War. And they in fact wanted to build a huge mausoleum, a Nazi-built mausoleum on our property, and we resisted that because we didn't want the Nazis to adopt, in inverted commas, the field marshal for their particular purposes. So we did not, though we did not know the Gestapo, the name was a difficult one for the Nazis to handle, and that's why the head of the Gestapo would take individual interest in the fate of my father as a prisoner in their prison system. So my mother got to see him, my father did too, but they were told pretty clearly that he was considered by them a traitor and needed to be executed.
Thank you for correcting that. We're going to we have a few minutes left, 20 minutes or so. We'd like to entertain questions from the floor. So if anybody would like to ask Helmut or me anything about the story and the letters, please feel free to do so. In the back?
When did the family first become Christian Scientists and how were they exposed?
When did they first become Christian Scientists? Well, as I mentioned, in 1899, when this lady's husband, Helmut von Moltke, this man's grandfather, was a young man, 25. He had suffered from various illnesses, diphtheria and a number of other things, and depression. And his mother, Mutter, was actually of Huguenot descent, and she was quite open to other religions besides the state religion of Evangelisch Lutheranism or Roman Catholicism. And she heard that there was a practitioner in Hanover that was doing great healing work, this Bertha Günther Petersen, and she took her son to this woman. And in 2 months, he was completely healed. And so he became, his life was completely changed. And he embraced this teaching very much. Then in 1902, 3 years later, when Dorothy and her mother came to play bridge, or rather stay, as I say, as paying guests on the country estate, and they met, that is when she became acquainted with Christian Science through Helmeuth. And she was very interested in it. She wasn't ill, she didn't have any health problems, but she liked the idealism, and she felt that it made a lot of sense to her. And she writes a great deal about this. She has a long letter to her father explaining, because her father was very skeptical. And I don't know about her mother, but her father was quite skeptical, not only of Christian Science, but I would think really not of religion in general. I think he was a very, would you agree with that? I think.
Well, Dorothy was educated, grew up as a Church of England Episcopalian under US terminology, and became a Christian Scientist. But they didn't bring their children up as Christian Scientists, and in fact, none of the children were Christian Scientists. They were all raised as Protestants, German Protestants, Lutherans, in other words, and the family is not a Christian, not part of the Christian Science Church at the present time. So it was just my grandfather who became a Christian Scientist, and his wife who followed him into this religion, and it was a big support for them in their life.
Yes, well put.
Do I understand that film footage of Roland Freisler's Volksgerichtshof is not available? Was it destroyed in air raids?
It depends on, did you hear the question?
I'll repeat it.
No, just have them.
Have them repeat it. Have them repeat it.
The question is whether the film footage of Freisler's trials of people following the Stauffenberg plot in July 1944, whether that film footage survived the war. And the answer is there are some parts of it which have survived, and there's still photographs of my father and the people who he was on trial with available. They survived. And there are some audio records of some of the other trials, particularly some of the August trials, August 44, right after the 20th of July. But the recordings and the footage, film footage of my father's trial has been lost.
Are there other letters, I think in particular letters from Helmut James, written that are available that would further enrich this family perspective on life in Germany? I'm just wondering, are there other letters available?
My father...
Can you repeat the question for the recording?
Are there letters available of Helmut James from Moltke, my father? And the answer is yes. My parents corresponded a great deal, and most of my father's letters have survived the war. They were protected by my mother and have survived the war. Few of her letters are available, and many of them, certainly in the period before his arrest, were published in the US too, under the title, Kate mentioned the book, Letters to Fire. But there is one a group of letters which so far have not been published in English, and that is the correspondence between both of them when my father was in jail and awaiting trial. And this is a correspondence which I published together with my sister-in-law in Germany in 2011, in other words, 3 years ago. And we are just in the process of beginning an English translation of that correspondence. So I expect that correspondence, which is a very remarkable correspondence in itself, will be available in the US in a few years' time.
I really loved hearing more, learning about Dorothy. And so how long did she live that Freya, like, were they living in America or
Yeah,
what's all that?
Yeah, she's asking about, yeah, I know. She's asking about Freya's relationship to her mother-in-law. This gentleman's mother, vis-a-vis Dorothy, the author of the letters. Well, Dorothy was born in 1886. Or was it 1884? I forget now. But anyway, around then. And Freya was born in 1911, and she married Helmeuth James in, what's it, 1931. So there was quite an overlap from 31. Well, and she knew, she was going, she knew the family before that, of course, before she married. So I would say she knew her for about 5 years at least, or 6 years.
And so my mother was married before my grandmother died. And then she was actually living with my father in Berlin, but once my grandmother died, she had to move to the estate in Silesia to be there. And that's how this correspondence between my father and my mother began, because they were often separated. He was working in Berlin and she was running the property in Silesia.
Could you describe the scene in Nazi Germany with synagogues and other religions that were persecuted? Did they destroy the synagogues? Did they destroy churches and mosques? What was the scene? What did the scene look like in Germany?
The question is, what did it look like in Germany? Did they destroy synagogues? Did they destroy churches? And how was it done? And the answer is, they certainly destroyed and burned synagogues during the Nazi period. What they did with other religions, and including the Christian Science religion, is that they circumscribed. What they did was that they created their own Protestant church, which was adapted to Nazism, and tried to make that the Protestant Church of Germany. And of course, there were also some people in the Catholic Church who were Nazis. So they restricted beliefs which were outside of the mainstream. So things like Christian Science was forbidden, and Jehovah's Witnesses was forbidden. A lot of religious beliefs outside the mainstream, which they controlled, were forbidden by the Nazis, and the churches were closed, but not destroyed.
But they did actually destroy documents. I mean, they went into the Christian Science churches and reading rooms and destroyed the records. And we were not allowed to have the periodicals, the church periodicals were not allowed to be distributed anymore. Actually, there's a nice account. When I was in Berlin, I met a relative, a family, a woman named Vera Pinter, whose grandmother was the sister of Count von Moltke. And she told me that her father was an officer in the Nazi army. He wasn't a Nazi, but he was in the army. And Vera's grandmother was also a practitioner in science. She had an office there, and evidently she kept on with practicing and with the periodicals. And she got in trouble with the Nazi government, and they threw her in prison. And Klaus von Stroke, Vera's father, went to the prison and spoke to the warden there, and they said, "How do you expect me to fight for Hitler when you keep my mother in prison?" So they let his mother out. But I mean, that shows you how close the prison is really affecting the family. And then I think it tells you also about the family, that they went right on. They didn't stop because of the laws, the so-called laws, I mean, Nazi laws. Liz? Somebody have a question? That's my hand. Wait. Oh, George.
Yeah, I just want to say, reinforce, I think, how important any document from this group is. And so I'm delighted to hear that the letters with Freya, with your mother, and with your father are going to be translated into English. I asked her at one point about those letters, and I think with a characteristic mixture of directness and humility, I think, which is misplaced. I think she said, "Oh, they were, his were the important things. They were just about, the farm and taking care of the children and this and that." And yet, everything she said, as far as I'm concerned, was remarkable. And I asked her about the Nazi Party and about its racism, and her remarks, I think, were extraordinarily direct and courageous, but they were worth. I mean, I remember. So I think there is an audience for those, and I think they're immensely valuable. Immensely valuable.
The comment that the letters of Ocean of my mother would be valuable, and if they were translated into English, because they and certainly I must agree with your comment. Her letters are also extraordinary.
Yeah, I want to just add to that I was allowed, the sister, no, I'm your aunt, right? But I was allowed to read your father's letters, and the farewell letters. Freya kind of gave them to me, and I was reading them at night, and she said, "Oh, my letters, they were kind of little notes." Yeah. And I think she told me at that point that she was going to throw them away. And then Eugen Rosenstock, she said, "You cannot do that." But I couldn't even read them, because she had typed your father's letters, and I read them one after one. And I couldn't sleep, and I was breathless, and Freya's letters were somehow little somethings like this, but they weren't burned. And I am so grateful and so happy that Eugen Rosenstock interfered and apparently said to her, "You cannot do that," because they were not only about Kreisau and keeping the estate and the oxen and the sowing and whatever, but they were very, as you know better than I, Caspar, they were very important documents in terms of answering and in a way carrying your father through his trials and through his life.
I think we had another question.
Well, I was just curious about other siblings. You said in the epilogue that you asked about her children.
Yes.
And
well, Veronica over there was married to the third son. And so he was a professor of urban design at Harvard.
She's the Veronica that I read in the author's note, that I called her. She was Mrs. von Moltke 10 years ago, and she answered the phone and said, "Oh, you want to talk to my sister-in-law?"
That is the
Thank you,
first.
Veronica.
One son died during the war. He was in the Air Force, in the German Air Force, and was shot down. And my father was executed. There was another son and a daughter who had survived the war and had families. who now live in Germany, essentially.
It's actually in the book, in the epilogue, I give a little brief account of what became of
Yeah,
that.
and if I may add that, my husband, who was the second brother of Helmut James von Moltke, Wilhelm Viggo von Moltke, who was the first director of urban design at the GSD, and I just delivered 12 boxes of letters and whatever. He told me when I came here to study and met this wonderful guy. I had no intention to get married in the United States, but I got this wonderful person to meet at my teacher's house, which was Rudolf Serkin, a great pianist. And he told me at that point that he was not going, he left Germany via England and couldn't get a visa and then went to Sweden because they needed architects. And my husband was a young architect, he was 27 years old. And at a certain point, and I've forgotten who, your father sent a message, Willow, you have to go to America. One of us has to survive. Whereupon my dear husband applied to go to America, age 27 or 28. I was barely born at that point, and was on the last boat which took Germans and came to America and had no visa. Okay? So this is the other part and of the von Moltke story.
Thank you. Thank you. And he actually was in the United States Army. I think I mentioned that earlier.
My husband was, and that I think will never be repeated, my husband was an officer in the United States Army and had a German passport.
Any more questions before we conclude? No, I think not. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Helmut, Casper, for